Gateshead.Net, a program which aims to uncover the truth behind the alien and UFO mystery. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's hour-long special program follows the amazing story of Robert Hall and the Gateshead Grey. My involvement with this incredible story started in September 2008, when I was holding a presentation at Cademan Hall about aliens and UFOs. I placed an article in the local free paper to advertise this talk, which included the Rich Planet phone number. One evening, about a week before the presentation, I received a call from a Geordie gentleman. He asked me if I was the one giving the talk. He then said, "Well, I've seen them," and over the next half hour proceeded to tell me the most fascinating story about a UFO and alien visitation. Robert Hall was just 5 years old when the events took place, and he described how a UFO appeared behind an invisible barrier in his street. He and another boy were abducted, taken on board the craft and examined by horrible creatures. His uncle Ernie, a coal merchant, lived in the next street and also witnessed one of the creatures. The events he described took place just a few miles away from the iconic Gateshead Angel, 58 years before the Angel was constructed. The year was 1940, and Britain was in the midst of the Second World War. Robert Hall lived in Bensham, an area of Gateshead filled with terraced houses driven by coal fires, a stone's throw away from the banks of the River Tyne. I was stunned by this story, and asked Robert if I could conduct a recorded interview over the telephone the following day. He seemed keen to do this. When I phoned him the next day, his attitude had changed, and he said that he no longer wanted to talk about the story because he had been ridiculed all of his life, and that this would just create more attention. Unperturbed by this, I read over the notes I had made during the conversation, and I noticed he had mentioned a few names of researchers that he had given his story to in the past. The first was David Boyle, who runs a very interesting UFO and paranormal attraction in Blackpool. I telephoned David, and he told me that he believed the core of Robert Hall's story to be true. I also contacted Gary Heseltine, who is a detective constable and writes for a UFO magazine. Some time ago he wrote a detailed account of Robert's story, so I arranged a telephone interview with Gary to find out a bit more about this mysterious case.
Yes, I'm a police officer with the British Transport Police, and I've been a serving officer for over 19 years. I'm now into my 20th year, and I've been a detective constable for the last 14 years. Robert Hall rang me up out of the blue one night in, I think it would probably be early 2003. My first 10 or 15 minutes, I'm thinking, yeah, I've got a nutter on the line here. That was my genuine thought. I thought, I've got somebody who's just rambling on, and but I wouldn't be rude and let him talk. And then it struck me that every time I asked him anything, he came back with what I thought was a lot of information. And he was mentioning street names and churches and scientists and whatever. I'm thinking, this is one hell of a story. And the more I asked him, and I think I must have talked to him for about 2 hours that first night, the more my opinion changed, that as bizarre as the whole story sounded, he appeared to have too much information, and with me working with suspects and witnesses, he appeared to be showing me signs of genuine recall. It didn't sound like a fabricated story, as crazy as it sounded. So I remember putting the phone down after the conversation and going through to my then partner and said, I've just spoke to a guy for 2 hours, and it's the most bizarre story I've ever heard in my life, and if it's true, it's the most fantastic UFO story I've ever heard. And that made me want to go meet him. So as soon as I was able, I went to go see him, and the man was just, like he was on the phone, and I said, look, all right, I've come up here, I want you to take me around all these places that you told me. If I think you're lying, I'll question you and whatever. And he took me around, and the more questions I asked, he just came back with detail upon detail, and I couldn't help but feel at the end that, as fantastic as it was, there was some kind of truthful element to it. But it obviously would be very, very hard to prove. Obviously, he told me about his Uncle Ernie Rain. I went to go see him, but unfortunately, whilst he was there in body, his mind was all over the place, and he was suffering with senile dementia. So literally anything he said wouldn't have counted for anything, because it wouldn't have held water, in the sense of that, you know, you could probably get the guy to say anything. So it wouldn't amount to anything. But I took a photograph of him, and then I spoke on the phone with his sister Rhoda, who was at the was and is 2 years older, and where he was 5, she was, I think, 7. Might have been 9, I might be wrong, but she was certainly a few years older, and she said, without being prompted, I can remember that there were scientists at the door for days after this all happened, and that she was there when this reporter came from the Chronicle, and who grabbed Robert when he wouldn't give him his story, and sort of threatened him. And so, you know, it was without prompting, it wasn't leading her. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. Something certainly must have happened. When he said, well, you know, it's from Mulholland, the tables were outside on Saltwell Road, from Mulholland Shop to Trescothick Street, that's just too much detail for a little kid to come out with if it hasn't happened. People don't mention so much detail when they're fabricating a lie. And so, you know, I, for one, think that at the heart of this is a very weird story. That's why, if you read that article again, I actually say, look, I'm putting this out because I'm tied up. You know, I'm looking for people to help me on this, to take it forward, and you know, perhaps you're the man. So, you know, I just think it's a fantastic story, and if we could ever get some kind of proper confirmation of essentially elements of the story in a newspaper, I think it would be a bit like discovering Roswell.
With the word Roswell ringing in my head, I now felt compelled to get to the bottom of this story. The events took place in 1940s Bensham, which is just a few miles from where I live, so I was ideally placed to get regular access to libraries and witnesses. However, I needed the cooperation of Robert Hall if I was going to get anywhere, so I decided to invite him and his wife to the Alien and UFO presentation at Gateshead Library. I sent him 2 free tickets in the hope that he would show up. To my delight, he arrived 5 minutes before the talk, and I shook his hand and he gave me a copy of the article written by Gary Heseltine. During the Alien presentation, he sat near the front, and I was aware of his presence. Several times I could hear him making noises of confirmation towards the facts given in my presentation. After the event, I arranged to telephone him the following day. To my total dismay, he went cold on me again. He explained that he was wary of people who wanted to profit from his story, and this seemed like his final word. A few weeks went by, and I couldn't get the story out of my head, so I decided to put my video camera in the boot of the car and go around and knock on his door. To my amazement, he looked very pleased to see us, and explained that he had suffered a few personal problems, and that he was now happy to do a televised interview. Robert Hall was no ordinary 5-year-old boy. Having spoken to him at length, on several occasions, both in person and on the phone, I now have a feel for his character. He is certainly a maverick, and as a child was often left to his own devices. He was happy to get on a tram by himself and travel to Newcastle, or even as far as Sunnyside, which is 5 miles away. A very adventurous and curious boy, with little interest in going to school. He wasn't afraid to break the rules, but would do anything to help anyone. Robert lived on the end terrace at 29 Headley Street with his mother and father, older sisters Rhoda and Cynthia, and his brother Harry was on the front line. At the side of the house is a back lane, known by locals as the bottom back lane, which runs parallel to the railway line and adjoins all of the adjacent streets. This lane was like a playground for all of the children who lived in these terraces. I started by asking Robert about his early life as a 5-year-old boy in Bensham in 1940.